Welcome to the Ridgemont podcast. I'm John Wallace, Managing Director of Ridgemont, a specialist construction and real estate law firm, and I'm sitting here with Brody, Head of Sustainability at McLaren, one of the most recognisable names in contracting in the UK. Brody, welcome to the Ridgemont podcast.
Hi, John.
It's tradition in our podcast to start off by walking through your career, going from school all the way through to where you are now. So where did you go to secondary school?
Yeah, so in Hertfordshire, Richard Hale School, where it was my secondary school.
And is that a state school or public school?
State, yeah.
And were you a good student?
I don't know, probably not, no. No, I went into getting about standard grades, like B's and C's. I was never like a fully like A-star student all the way through, but I think it all started to come together when the leashes were let go and you went into uni and you started to do a bit more of yourself learning.
You're a bit more independent. What was your favourite subjects at school?
I really liked art and I really liked PE, and geography was I did enjoy learning about it.
You went on to study geography at university. So what motivated you to study that?
I really like being outdoors, and funnily enough, even though I find myself there now most of the time, I didn't see myself sitting behind a desk and being out, in the fields, rivers, mountains, rocks, that kind of stuff really appealed to me at the time.
Yeah.
Certainly like with the whole, if you could interact with wildlife as well was definitely a drawer to that.
So then you worked at Swan Housing Group.
That's right, yeah.
And what were you doing then?
Yeah, so I was an assistant sustainability coordinator, still my longest title. And it was it was around the time, 2012, where everything was 20% reduction by 2020, which just seemed to be everyone's strapline.
Yeah.
I didn't put that strategy in place, but it was really just recording environmental data. So energy, water, waste, obviously working for a housing association as well. You've got the social side of it as well, which I think now has come much more into the fore.
Yeah, and so you were talking about the 20% reduction by 2020. Were people taking sustainability seriously then, or was it just a buzzword?
From what I saw, it was just a buzzword at the time. It was starting to come into contracts, but I don't think anyone really knew what they wanted, but they knew that they needed to start asking for it. And certainly from a landlord's perspective, being a registered landlord, you have to think about the planet, the people as well. So there was a bit of, I think, excitement, but also mystery on like what these people would do, like coming into the business. But quickly enough, we started to see like the efficiencies, reduction of energy from all of our residents and water as well. So see, saving their money was a real important thing, certainly from a social landlord's perspective.
Well, and for Swan, where was the pressure coming from? Was it just from the market, or
it certainly wasn't coming from the senior leadership team. I think it was more the clientele. If the funds wanted to see what impact was having with our residents.
Yeah, okay.
I was quite junior at that point, so it's probably more, it's my first job, I'm just gonna
head down.
Didn't really understand what the senior leadership team was up to at that point.
You then go to Viridian Housing, which is that a similar sort of place?
Yeah. So their headquarters was in Clapham, but they merged into Optimo, but they went from 44 to about 75,000 units. We moved into Optimo, so one of the big, I think it was top 5 at the time. So yeah, I was there for about 3.5 years, I believe, and kind of rose through the ranks quite quickly.
Did you start off doing the same job?
Well, it was a promotion to environment officer, but environment, sustainability, it's a really good topic actually, because certainly when you get into the more on-site stuff, there are really key differences which not a lot of people gather. But yeah, I was basically doing a similar role, but one was sustainability and one was environment, but they're both the same.
And to the lay person, what is the difference?
So sustainability is more around the longevity of the business. So you're looking at the actual carbon emissions. I would say water consumption comes into it, air quality, material sourcing. We're going to touch on BREEAM, World Lead, Neighbours, all these building certifications. They're sustainability aspects. But then when you go onto site, certainly from a construction standpoint, environment is compliant, making sure that you're not polluting the waterways, that you're not, like this, if there's a spill, that you've like done that correctly. Waste is a massive part, and that whole duty of care legislation from the Environment Act, that's all environmental.
Right, so they're quite distinct.
Yeah.
You then did a master's in sustainable urbanism. What motivated you to do that?
I was still at Viridian Housing at the time, and it came about that retrofitting properties, reducing the really bad rated energy efficient properties, certainly from a social landlord's perspective. And I was producing their retrofit strategy.
So when would this have been?
I think this was around 2015, 16. It was before Grenfell, which we'll come on to, because that was an important part of my journey. And yeah, it just aligned very nicely with the work that I was doing, writing the strategy for the business, as well as how we're reducing our EF and G rated properties.
Yeah.
Did my thesis in technical barriers to external wall insulation. So I can say now, with it out sounding weird, that I did go around at night looking at people's houses with a thermal imaging camera. Yes, that actually happened, and then was like writing it in the middle of the night to look at how heat was, because I was doing it in summer, so I couldn't do it during the day. So yeah, that was there, and it really helped with my learning. I have being able to apply because I was doing a module on retrofitting houses at the same time. It was just wow, this is incredible. So for anyone who's listening, I would say that if you can combine your masters with the work that you're doing at the same time, I benefited significantly from that.
Well, I think that applies to any kind of learning. If you can kind of learn it at the same time that it's relevant to what you're doing, then that's great. So you moved from Viridian then to Lend-Lease, so a big move.
Yeah, I actually went travelling. So I had a bit of a hiatus.
Where did you go?
Well, one way around the world, but it was a lot of Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Fiji, South America, all that. And cool. Yeah, one year, which was meant to be 6 months. These things go a little bit longer. But the reason I left is that throughout that work with the masters and writing the strategy, a lot of it was to do with external wall insulation. And
you're the expert in it.
Well, I was then. I can't say for much now. But I was on holiday, and Grenfell happened. We were watching it on your iPad on the beach, and it's all a bit surreal, not having a clue what kind of impact this was going to have on just the building sector, the renting sector. And during that time, over about a year period, we'd worked with the local authorities in 2 London boroughs really closely. I had to pay quite a bit of money to just show them our designs. Were they happy with it? Because we were working in conservation areas.
Yeah.
And I came back, and within about 2 weeks, over 50 planning applications had been rejected due to it being with insulation on the outside of the building, which is one of the main components to Grenfell. So yeah, kind of quite naively, I was just like, you know what, I'm done with this after, because there was obviously still stuff to do, but I'd done my masters around it, right? Yeah, and then wrote the strategy. So it's like now's probably a good time to have a bit of a break, and then came back a year later.
Did you see Grenfell coming?
No, not at all. I think at that point, still less than 5 years into my career, I was still quite naive around the design of buildings. I think, especially not working in construction as such. A lot of it was to do with asset management.
Yeah.
Which then moving on to Lend-Lease and beyond was more than heavy, in the build, in the construction of the new project rather than asset management, albeit there was a delivery arm.
So what was your role at Lend-Lease?
Sustainability manager. So I wasn't the first time maybe in that position, but looking at new projects and huge projects. So KGX1, which is Google's headquarters. Yep, seen it. Yep, still being built to this day. And also 8 Bishopsgate, which is a 53-storey skyscraper in the City of London, as well as International Quarter London, which is the redevelopment outside Stratford. The Westfields, if you think out East London way, starts.
So with a skyscraper, where do you start?
At the bottom. Heavy design. It's probably worth mentioning that I was predominantly in the construction area of Lend-Lease, so we didn't get heavily involved in the design. But certainly at IQL it was more design led, and I started to see that because there are huge differences between building, a project like that and then going through the design phase. Yeah, not many people know that Google's headquarters started its life off as 3 separate buildings. Yeah, and then so they'd even started the foundations, and then actually let's have a bit of a rethink on this, and still cracking at it.
So do you start with the foundations? Is that literally where you start?
With construction, yeah. I mean, well, it depends what kind of site there is there. There's if there's something already there, you would look at doing a pre-demolition audit, thinking about the materials and how they're going to be, disposed of correctly. We're going to touch on that, I think, a little bit later. But then, you've got to think about the placemaking aspect, what it looks like, how it fits in. There's loads of rules within London, even to the point that at a certain point within London, you have to see St Paul's. So if you build up across this line, this, imaginary line, you won't be approved. Yeah. So there's a lot of stuff like that, how it interacts with the local community, where you're going to be sourcing the materials from. Does it fit in? You won't see a skyscraper in the middle of Sutton suburb, for instance. Yeah.
And so how long were you at Lend-Lease for?
I think it was 2.5 years, just over.
Okay.
Yeah, about 2 years, 9 months.
And then an opportunity came up at McLaren.
Yes, yeah.
What excited you about that?
It was that they were in a place where they were trying to break into these markets with clientele who were putting really stringent sustainability requirements on. And they'd just been in a position where they were outsourcing all of that. So their consultancy fees were growing and growing. And they're like, well, hang on a minute, we could potentially bring this in-house. So the work that I've done, with managing people before at Viridian, which turned into Optivo, and then at Lend-Lease, I did my BREEAM AP and my LEED AP as well. So I had some management experience, had the technical abilities to deliver, large projects. So it seemed like a good stepping stone to start to progress my career into that more mid-level, then into senior management.
What's the difference between the work you were doing at Lend-Lease and what you're now doing at McLaren?
That's a really good question. It's managing the function. So I have a team of 10 individuals, and across the different business units, because we operate in London, outside of London, in Midlands and North, and also having that oversight of the design, and then how that interacts. Would say you're getting client deliverables, and how about you then go about that, and from a cost of efficiency and business acumen perspective, how do you not blow your budget out of the water but then still deliver on what the client's asking for? So there's that from an operational perspective, both in pre-con and construction. But I think the biggest change is that the people management aspect of it, like with the other senior leaders within the business, but then, project directors, so having to build that relationship, which can be really difficult.
Well, I was going to ask you, so do the other senior leaders see you as an obstacle to construction or a enabler?
There are individuals within construction who it's the classic, isn't it? I've been doing this for 30 years, so why do I need to change? But when you really go through the client's deliverables and what they're expecting, if you can't deliver on what the client is asking, whether that be through not understanding the requirements or just like an unwillingness to deliver on it, soon enough it's either been highlighted to the client and it's pulled out. It's either going to cost you money or time, which from a project's perspective, program and cost are the two most important things. So if you're talking to a project manager or a project director or even a commercial director and you're saying, if we haven't got this right, it's going to time or program is going to creep, then all of a sudden you've got there. And so understanding what drives certain individuals, and that's just not from a commercial perspective, it's from a design perspective. Within BREEAM, which is a sustainability rating system for Europe, there are credits around doing thermal imagery to look at the thermal barriers within the building. So if there's any cold spots, you then have to go back and rectify it.
Yeah.
So if you haven't, if you haven't followed the design and the build up of the wall or the floor, the roof, you're going to have to go in and make the changes, which Boston program.
Get it right first time.
Yes.
You've obviously worked very hard to get to being head of sustainability at McLaren. Why? It's a question that we ask all our guests on the podcast. What motivated you to do what you've done in order to get where you've got to?
So when I was a child, I was outdoors. Like certainly, before like the age of like 12, I would say, when I think computer games then like became a part, I would be constantly outside. You wouldn't find me inside. So, and I was quite lucky to live on the back of a woodland. So to be able to go out and experience nature, without your parents there, it was fantastic. Like I couldn't really thank my parents enough for that experience. But then that experience then has progressed quite significantly as me and an adult. And I mentioned like the traveling, and I'm a really outdoorsy person. So when I was in New Zealand, I was lucky enough to go to walk around the glaciers, scuba diving on the Great Barrier Reef.
Wow.
To know that our children might not, and certainly from the glacier perspective, this glacier, the specific glacier that I was on, definitely will not be there in 15 years. To know that and to kind of embody that within myself, and to know that I can have a change, make the change within the construction industry, which is arguably one of the biggest polluters on the planet. It really gives me an emphasis on like personal drive, and something that I can. It's quite tangible, to me, the impact that climate change is going to have due to my education and it's working in the construction industry. So that is a real that really resonates within me about a drive that if I don't work as hard as I can, yes, there will be other people doing it as well. But there's also another quite interesting thing about when I was born. So I've got a plan to retire in 2050, which works quite nicely with your retirement.
Because you sustainability people love a date like.
Well, 2050 is quite a big date on the climate change calendar. So kind of got it in my mind that we will see how successful we are when I retire.
Great. Okay. You said you weren't really academic when you were at school. How did you get to where you are?
Being passionate about the subject is I would say really important, because when you're starting doing carbon reporting and you're looking at, say, like science-based target initiatives and the other reporting accolades that come with it, and you're just looking at numbers, it can become a little bit dry. I'll be the first one to say that. Like any accounting role, if there are any accountants on the call or listening, I'm sorry. But then it's that tangibility stuff. I'm like, right, well, if them numbers are going down, then we're having a good impact on what we're doing. But I also think from an operational standpoint and being able to communicate these things, I think one of the things that I'm, without bigging myself up too much, I think being able to put something quite complicated into simple terms, that has really helped. Because when you're talking to, like the financial director of the business or, like the CEO, and just saying why we need to do this, not because it's a nice to have, but because it's fundamental to the operations of the business and the success of the business, that has, I think, worked and has helped really, really well. But there's also a lot of working groups out there. So at my time at Lendlease, I was on the Sustainability Supply Chain School. Mm-hmm. They've got lots of different groups. There was one on fuel, embodied carbon, social value, and I was on their fuels group. And I was quite young at that point, and just being able to hear what experts in the industry were thinking and how it was progressing forward with regards to all these sustainability topics. But the fuel and the decarbonisation of construction activities is obviously a really, really important one. Yeah. We're talking about Scope 1 carbon emissions for any construction company, about what's happening on site. And that then led me to almost, produce my own alternative fuels policy, which I was like, this can work. There's challenges here, certainly, and it's not a blanket approach. It's a staggered approach, looking at, liquid petroleum gas, diesel, small plant, big plant, and being able to communicate that to then the business and why we should be doing this. And I have to admit, working at Lendlease was an absolute godsend, because their ear was already there. They're what? Well over like 50 years old now. So a very established business, and to bring forward a policy like that wasn't overly radical. Yeah, especially at the time where it was the first policy as such in the UK to be implemented on a construction site. Now you see quite a lot of others going in that place, and you obviously learn a lot from there. So, and then there's also the UK GBC, the UK Green Build Council. They also have a lot of groups which you can be getting involved in, and even if you're not an expert, you can be involved in this group and listen to the experts and learn from that. So I'm kind of with the master's degree, with that, them different groups has really helped.
Okay, what's been the biggest obstacle you've overcome in business?
So I'd say getting buy-in from the different areas within. If we're talking about construction, I think that's where I've had my biggest impact within my career. Being able to get buy-in and getting different individuals, not just see it as a nice to have, but an essential to deliver a sustainable business. So whether it's like estimating, planning, commercial, we mentioned around the communication and what you're going to pick up on with them. So if you're talking to a planner, program is obviously the biggest driver. Yeah. So you don't want to impact the program. We're like, well, if we get this wrong, we're going to impact the program. Then you're like, oh, right, well, then they start listening. And it's the same with estimating. If you're going to be driving costs up, and obviously commercial with costs.
I mean, from everything you've said, it sounds like a big part of it was helping others see sustainability in a different light, rather than a blocker, as something that was now an element of the business, whether you like it or not, and we have to run with it.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, it's the changing of these very sometimes entrenched views on that it's an additional cost, And, I'll be honest with you, a lot of the time it is an additional cost, but if it's in the client's requirements to deliver that, it's not just an additional cost to us who are tendering it, it's to every other company who's also tendering it. It's an additional cost. But so if we've got the processes, or if we know, I'll use concrete as an example because it's the biggest contributor to carbon emissions globally. And within concrete, cement is the contributor. If you look at like the aggregates and the water, they're very, very low. It's the
What is it about cement that is?
It's just the manufacturing process of it is very energy intensive, ultimately. And if you can replace the cement with cement replacements, and GGBS is the common one that we go for, which is granulated ground glass slag, then that's, from a cost perspective, they're about equal. GGBS in recent, like the last kind of like 2 years, has got a little bit more expensive. But the impact of putting GGBS into cement, it doesn't set as quickly. And that then has program implications. But we've been looking at, technologies which are monitoring actual live air temperature.
Yeah.
And using that data to, if it's a warmer day or a warmer period, you can increase your GGBS percentages without having an impact on the program. So it's like bringing tools and, technology into it to how we can hit a specification that's been set by a client, but then not impact on program at the same time.
Does that complicate construction?
Oh, yes. Yeah, a lot. And we touched on it previously when we were saying, I've built this way for 20 years. Why do I need to change? And I think that the example that I just gave about using technology to change a process, but that ultimately delivers the same output is really interesting. And there's a lot in this space. Certainly, a lot of use of AI that we're seeing coming through.
Cool.
Which I'm sure we can
We don't need to build like the Romans anymore.
That's no.
What advice would you give your 20-year-old self?
Travel more. That's obviously not to do with construction, but yeah, I think that for me, from a sustainability perspective, I mentioned, the different items around the glacier, the Great Barrier Reef. These are my drivers. So if you can go out and see, there's islands in the Pacific and the Caribbean that in 20 years probably won't be there. So you're like, well, do you want to go and see them? Do you not? Then that, it's important to some people. It's certainly important to me to be able to see the impact that I'm going to be having, from a longevity perspective. There's
have you used that in presentations with your teams?
No, well, within the sustainability team, yes, but in construction, you got to be quite careful with how you go about things.
Yeah.
And I think depending on the ethos of the business, that might be relatable, but then in others it might not be. So I get that. And you've also got to be quite careful that if you are banging the wrong drum, not to repeatedly bang it, because if you've lost the room, then it's even more difficult to then come back and try and get in it.
Cool.
But I'll just on the point of, and being a bit more technical, there's a lot of use with Power BI now, which is a souped up version of Excel, really, where you're looking at live data sets. We use multiple tools, so we have to record transport data. We have to get live data off construction sites, energy, water, waste. And more, there's a lot of companies out there that are creating this data lake. So, and that pulls, raw data out of lots of platforms. And once it's in that data lake, it's your data.
Yeah.
And you can manipulate it the way that you want. And Power BI can go into these data lakes and produce pretty much anything that you want to see. So obviously for sustainability, like your carbon emissions, but then also how that's impacting on your program, how that's impacting on costs, how it's impacting on design. And you can use that to engage with these other teams that previously were...
So it makes it real relevant.
Exactly. So to my 20-year-old self, I'd say get involved in... Hasn't been Power BI hasn't been around for, that long, but certainly getting involved in the data and understanding how Excel and like all these, with the likes of Power BI can work. Because if you can unravel the data and you can get that data to tell a story, luckily enough, we've got a sustainability data analyst in the team who does this. But I'd want to be able to do that myself.
Is that tech improving all the time?
Touched on AI. There's lots of different applications of it now, but being able to read a delivery ticket and then that tell you how much carbon emissions are associated to that product by reading the delivery ticket, where it's come from, so how much carbon emissions are associated to that. Is it relevant to the specification, or is it just like this product that's just arrived that you don't need on your construction site? That is really, really powerful.
Yeah.
And again, if you've got a piece of material that isn't correct and then it's installed, hopefully it's not too long until that's been notified and not at the end of the project when there's about another 5 layers of materials on top of it, for sure.
Okay, we've reached the stage in the podcast where I quote a load of data that I've got off the internet, so query whether it's true or not, but give us a feel for sustainability, where we are now. So there's an RICS 2022 sustainability report that points to an increasing growing demand for green commercial property, with 55% of contributors noting that global occupier demand for green or sustainable buildings has risen over the last 12 months. Both the RICS 2021 and 2022 reports note that there's a market premium for green buildings. 50% of those surveyed reported a brown discount, non-green buildings being the subject of rental price reductions compared to their green equivalents. Concrete is the most widely used synthetic material in the world, globally 30 billion tonnes each year, but also one of the most environmentally unfriendly. Its manufacture alone is responsible for between 4 and 8% of global carbon dioxide emission. 2021 figures suggest that steel manufacture makes up about 11% of global carbon dioxide emissions, and the built environment is said to be responsible for 40% of global carbon emissions. Are we doing enough?
There's a lot of work happening in this space, and no, I think is the correct answer. But there is a lot of work. So if we look at, and it's moving and progressing all the time. So 10 years ago, we just had BREEAM as a sustainability rating system. Now we've got WELL, which looks at the well-being and health of the occupants of the building. And we see, from my personal experience, that's the biggest increase that I've seen on commercial properties. Because BREEAM outstanding is pretty much a given, certainly within within London.
Yeah.
But having an impact on, or looking at the impact of how this building is working with the residents or, the occupiers rather than against it. So, I've worked with the IWBI who administrate WELL. And since COVID, the increase in take up is gone crazy. It's like a balloon.
Could you give us an example of a factor WELL would consider?
Air quality and water quality. So these things that and don't get me wrong, BREEAM does look at it, but then almost like a light touch approach, where you need to do the actual verification, and you come in and people do like the air testing, people do the water testing to a degree which is scientific, like really looking like parts per million on VOCs and much further than building regulations. And it's really important. And when you start to think about a business's expenditure, the rent is high, but then how much are you paying your staff? That's a much bigger element of it. And how efficient and effective that the people are working. If they're off sick because, or there's so much glare on their screens, or they've got a migraine or a headache because the air quality or the water quality isn't quite right within the building. That then has a massive impact on the effectiveness of the build, and the companies are becoming savvy to that.
Yeah, and why are all these things? Why is sustainability important to developers now?
Developers, I would say it's down to their investors. The investment firms have really got, they've been told by their, by government and regulation that they're the ones that are going to drive this change. So, we had our auditors in a couple of weeks ago, and they're asking us about all of our ESG requirements, which hadn't happened. And they're looking at that about what potential impact that have we forecasted for, and is there a pot of money essentially aside to deal with that, is what it's looking at. But yeah, it's a good question, but you can see that the funds are asking for it, therefore the clients are asking for it, therefore the clients are asking the principal contractors, and that just kind of filters down, which prior to say 5-6 years ago there wasn't that drive, let's say, from the funds, which is now why it's everywhere rather than just in some very well-minded ethical businesses.
Talk to us about this idea of a circular economy and whether that's the answer to our problems.
It isn't the answer, but it is I believe the most single biggest step that we've taken it's across the planet, really. It's not just construction. We're looking at circularity in all sectors. But what we're talking about there's a great example of this around waste coming out of buildings. We touched on the demolition, like retrofit of buildings. 1% of building waste will go back into a building as new material. So you just think about that. So all the building products that are around us right now, or anyone listening to it, the buildings that you're in, less than 1% of all that material actually came from a building previously. Now, the planet is a finite resource. There's not 10 planets. There's one, obviously. And if we're not working to be more efficient with waste, which is discarded, think about, again, everything in this room, everything around us at some point will be discarded.
Yeah.
How is that going to be discarded? Is it just going to go to landfill? Is it going to be incinerated? Which, it's incineration, you're looking easily about 50 to 60% of waste is incinerated.
Wow.
So how can we work to improve that figure? And the system enablers of that are that, if you think about every material, how do we get that back into a building material? Or, how do you get a laptop back into another laptop? And there's loads of work happening on this, and it's something that I'm really passionate about. I think you probably touched on the point that I'm most passionate about in all of it, because it is our biggest challenge.
Yeah.
Because if we can't crack that, you're just going to be using more and more virgin material until it's so scarce, or it's run out. Because we're not at the point where we were in like the 1950s, 1960s, where we're like, oh right, the ocean, it's endless. It will always be producing fish. Like you can see that the impact that we've had on that is borderline criminal, I'd say.
And on the rivers.
Yeah. The rivers as well. You look at how much fish are migrating up rivers and spawning and then coming out back to sea, significantly less. But so we're working on certain projects where we're working on the circular economy to glass, concrete, steel, aluminium, plasterboard. So probably like the big 5, I'd say, within construction. We've worked with a company called Saint-Gobain. They're one of the biggest glass manufacturers in the world. And then within London, a company called Powerday, a waste contractor.
Yeah.
Waste contractors have a massive part to play in this. And what we've done on a project, Chalcott's Estate in Camden, where we're replacing the facade on 650 plus units. So it's, think about 4 or 5 windows on every unit. There's a lot of glass you're talking about there. It's around about 90 tons. We've worked with Powerday and Saint-Gobain, so we've got a methodology which now takes the window out in situ, so you're not smashing it. That then gets transported to one of the Powerday's facilities within London, where they've got a piece of kit where you can put the glass through, and it's still got spacer bars, so it's still like in its frame. Yeah. Smashes the glass out, goes up a conveyor belt, comes over the cullet, which is the broken glass, goes down, and the spacer bar gets spat out the end. Once they've got enough of this material there, then Saint-Gobain come and pick it up, take it back to their manufacturing facility and put it right back into new glass. And we're feeding the amount of recycled content which they can then process through.
That's amazing. I heard of a firm of architects, and the name escapes me, who have created an online platform to enable the design of buildings using essentially second-hand RSJs.
Okay.
So it has them all in a catalogue, and then you can join them together to create what you want to create. I mean, this kind of tech is going to change construction, right?
Yeah, definitely. And we're looking at it from the reuse perspective. And there's a real difference between reuse and recycling. What I mentioned with that glass is we are recycling it. We're not reusing it. We're not taking it out and putting it back in as it was. Yeah. And that's a really important piece to understand, because if you're reusing something, it has to be re-specified to meet new, the regulations. And we're seeing it within steel, where there are now there's guidance, and there's a difference between pre-1960s steel and post-1960s steels. Don't ask me why, but there's obviously something happened in that time period which was really important. And now you can get a CE mark once it's gone through this recertification process. Now that's great, because now it's got this CE mark on it. The insurers are quite happy to go forward with it. Yeah. Where if it didn't have that, there was a massive question on insurance and warranty as well. So we're slowly getting there, but then how do we get that steel out? And it's not just steel; it's all building materials, because there's a huge disconnect at the moment within the construction industry about deconstruction versus demolition. Mm-hmm. And the problem is that clients are asking for the building to be demolished. Of course, you need that. But they're getting it at the cheapest rate that they possibly can. Yeah. And rightly so. When we're talking about cost and program, the shorter you can make it, the cheaper it is going to be. So taking a building apart piece by piece does not have from the high level perspective, isn't the cheapest route. But with that problem that I mentioned earlier around finite issue and 1% of building waste going back into buildings, we have to tackle that. Like, that is the crunch point I see the construction industry having to overcome for the next 10, 15 years.
Is the answer to that AI and robots? And
that I haven't looked at it in a lot of detail, but there is programs out there and robots that can deconstruct buildings. But if you don't have the data to tell you what's in the building in the first place, you're not going to be able to do it. Like, yeah, you can go around and you can do a pre-demolition audit. Yeah, you can. But until you start pulling the building apart, you don't know where a lot of this stuff is. So if you don't have the data that tells you where the materials are, say a lot of these buildings that were taken down, the 1950s, 1960s, there's the information isn't there.
Yeah. And there's asbestos everywhere.
Well, yeah, I'm touching on another point. That's environmental, that bit, not for the sustainability bit.
Okay, let's move on to talking about Marks & Spencer's refusal of planning permission in relation to their off Oxford Street store. Stuart Machin, who's the chief exec of Marks & Spencer's, was reported by The Guardian to have called Michael Gove's decision playing to the gallery and a short-sighted act of self-sabotage. And Mr. Machin was quoted in the Telegraph as saying that Gove was sending a chilling message to the towns and cities across the UK in desperate need of regeneration. Gove responded that permission had been refused because it would fail to support reuse of existing resources, including the conversion of existing buildings. Where do you sit on that discussion?
Well, the whole refusal has come from the UK's target to be net zero carbon by 2050. To see this quoted in a planning refusal for the first time is historic. It's a historic moment for the UK construction industry, built environment as a whole.
Yeah.
So I'm really supportive of it. But then what ramifications is this going to have? Because I think some of the comments around, playing to the gallery, there is an element of that because it's the first one. So but then there's got to be clear guidance then after this around what level do you need to get to with regards to the reuse of a building before you hit a threshold, which will then say you're actually not in line with the UK 2050 targets. And to be quite honest, you look at planning guidance and documents, so you've got whole life carbon assessments, which is part of the GLA's planning requirement. You've got circular economy statements, which highlight reuse elements. But there's nothing in there to say you need to reuse, let's say, 50% of the building. Otherwise, you are in breach of UK government legislation.
I think what was galling to Marks and Spencer's was the fact that they cited several buildings on Oxford Street that had been demolished and rebuilt. Do we need consistency as well?
Yeah, well, that's the point I'm making. Now that you've got the first one, it's more than likely that across the UK there's been planning permission granted that has more of an impact than was on M&S and Oxford Street from a demolition perspective. So then where does it go next? When the government have got to act quite quickly on it, not to make it a farce. It's been it's been knocking around for over a year now.
Yeah.
So, with the building safety bill coming out as well, which again, another podcast for that.
Let's not go into that.
Where is the guidance on why that is? Because you've got to go into how many kilograms of CO2. This is a metric, for embodied carbon. The kilograms of CO2 against meters squared of GIA, which is gross internal area.
Yeah.
Somewhere on this level, and there's guidance out there around what's good and best practice within these figures, and the GLA have got it. And there's other certification programs and guidance by Letty and Ricks that put that out there. So you're going to have to align that decision to like a number somewhere, and if you don't, then anyone who's putting planning permission in for the demolition of any project will have that in their mind. And so until the guidance has come out and it's clear, there's going to be like a negative spin or a bit of uncertainty about, is this actually going to get planning permission? And there is a lot of money spent on what a building looks like, the design, that before it goes into planning. So you'll get certainly probably with Oxford Street now and within London as well, there's a big development that's going to have to be torn down and rebuilt back up like M&S. You can bet that there's some hesitation on whether or not we should do that now or wait until this item has been resolved. Very similar to Grenfell, right? With what happened there, and there was then, we've already touched on it, haven't we, about all these planning applications which I put in, which then got refusal.
How do you balance sustainability concerns with commerciality? So, for example, Marks and Spencer's say that Oxford Street store is a labyrinth. It's a rabbit warren inside, and they've had 16 designs or 15 designs, and they can't seem to make the building work. Why should they be frustrated in owning substantial real estate that doesn't work for them?
Well, there's two parts to the question there, and we'll touch on the sustainability versus commercial aspect first, and I'll relate back to lots of the topics we were talking about earlier around it's now a fundamental ask of investors, and therefore that's going down into the clients, and that's going into the subcontractors. So there is a golden thread, as you were, not to quote the Builder Safety Rule, that of you can see where it's coming from, and therefore if it's being asked for, it should be paid for as well. So there is that, but of course then it's how much is it going to cost, and you can a client can easily specify that. There isn't any. Yeah, but you do get areas within London which say, BREEAM Excellent is a planning requirement.
Yeah,
I haven't seen BREEAM Excellent as a planning requirement, and BREEAM Excellent is pretty standard. But we don't see, for like a new commercial building, you don't see, right, we're going to, certainly with the projects that I see, very good as a standard anymore. It's excellent and above.
Yeah.
So that's already built in and costed for. It's when you start, right, how can we go to excellent, from excellent to outstanding? But again, we've got to a point where it actually doesn't cost that much anymore. In the grand scheme of things of how much a building costs, you're talking about like a £70 million new building. It's not going to cost, you might be looking at 1% to 2%. And if the client's asking for that, 1% to 2% on £70 million isn't that much if you think about it.
Yeah.
But then the big impacts come in when we're looking at embodied carbon, and are you increasing the amount of GGBS in the concrete? Are you increasing the recycle? We're all talking, all this embodied carbon aspect is about volume of material, but then more importantly, recycled content.
Yeah.
It's that reuse aspect that we were talking about earlier, producing more recycled content to go back into materials. Because it's seen as a nice to have, let's say, increasing the recycled content is seen as like an environmentally good product to have. So then there's a price tag that's associated to that. And when we start to look at reducing your embodied carbon emissions in a project and how far you want to go, that's when the price is, if you haven't built it in from the offset and you're looking at it, like 6 months before you're about to start on site, then can be significant costs to it. So kind of gone in that about a roundabout way.
Yeah.
But you can certainly say that if it's asked for by the client at the beginning, and we touched on the demolition and the demolition contractors, have they priced for it? As a principal contractor price for it, there's the subcontractor price for it. Because if it's been done from the outset, it's embedded in the cost all the way through. Where if you come in halfway through and say, well, actually now I want to have a green wall there rather than, that brick wall.
Yeah.
It hasn't been costed for at the beginning. So then it's an additional cost for the project.
What is the single solution to current sustainability issues that you think the construction sector should champion?
I would say this whole reuse aspect. We've got to get over the hurdles of, one, how we deconstruct a building versus demolition, which I already touched on. But then how do we get the material in its most highest value state back to the manufacturer? Because there's lots of work happening on it, but it's little pieces. I've mentioned one. There's a few others that we're getting involved in with steel. But how does that become a mainstream? Like, this is our standard. And another one would be, say, like raised access floors. they have got significant embodied carbon impacts on it. And if we can go in and do the demolition or, the refurbishment, whatever you want to call it, and be able to take these materials out and get them re-specified and back into buildings. And it is happening. It's happening on multiple fronts, but it's not happening anywhere near around the volumes that it needs to. And then because the client is asking for it to be done at the lowest cost, you aren't getting demolition contractors coming in and just smashing it out and incineration and whatever. If we can crack that, because the problem is there isn't enough recycled content. So if you think the increase your recycled content, you're reducing your carbon emissions. Yeah, because you're not taking virgin material out of the ground. And you can take like Saint-Gobain's glass manufacturing process. They can have the furnace 200 to 400 degrees cooler, melting recycled cullet virgin material. So it's like a win-win.
What's the environmental cost of transporting it?
Transport is a really interesting one, because people who haven't looked at it would say, well, if we're buying our steel from Europe, because there's a lot of electric arc furnaces in Europe and there isn't over here, and electric arc furnace is significantly less carbon intensive than your standard blast furnace, because you're electric. But then using a blast furnace over an electric arc furnace causes 5 more times the amount of carbon emissions. So for every ton of every ton of steel that's produced in a blast furnace, there's 2.5 tons of carbon emissions that's associated to it. Using an electric arc furnace, 0.5 tons of CO2 for every ton of steel. When you start to look at transport costs in the grand scheme of a building and how much energy has been used to produce the materials, including the transport, you're looking at around about 2 to 3% of the overall carbon emissions. So it is important, and locally sourced material should take precedent because you're helping the local community. But the steel is a great example. Where should we be getting our steel from? Should we be buying it in the UK, or should we be buying it in Europe from a carbon perspective? Every day of the week, Europe for the electric arc furnace from a carbon perspective.
Brody Isaac is Head of Sustainability at McLaren, Tier 1 Contractors. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, John.
If you have enjoyed this podcast, then email us at contact@ridgemont.co, and we will add you to our newsletter so that you can see when the next podcast is available.